this session. So if you don't want your image to appear, please feel free to turn your camera off. I would encourage people to introduce yourself into the chat on the side so that everyone, so we build a little bit more of a community here in terms of this conversation. And that if you're not already connected up with the monthly newsletter from the Zero Waste Network, feel free to send a message to me with your email address and I can add you onto that. It goes out on the 15th of every month with kind of all the latest news and views from the Zero Waste Network. And the last thing before I turn over to Sue is that I just wanted to say that there's going to be plenty of opportunity for questions towards the second half of this conversation. So feel free to think about what questions you'd like to ask, but equally well, if you want to put questions in the chat, I'll keep a close eye on the chat. And so, yeah, we will, I think, have ample opportunity for all of those questions. So I'm going to turn over to Sue, who's going to have a chat, and then, tag team a bit with Hannah on that. Kia ora, Sue.
Hello. Hi, Merv here.
Sorry, Merv, can you mute yourself?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I'm.
Can you mute yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. View. Where are we?
Okay. All right. I'll get started. Hey everyone, thanks so much for taking up your lunch hour with our, spending your lunch hour with us. It's always awesome to see who's there. And what I'm going to do at the beginning is just give you a bit of an introduction to what's going on and what's going to happen with the consultation opportunities to submit. So that's my first little bit. You've got 3 different options for doing a submission to this consultation. The first one is a short submission, which is, what we're calling the 2-minute option. And that Kiwi Bottle Drive, you can see it on the screen there now. Kiwi Bottle Drive has put together a collective, some key collective points that have been worked out with a range of different groups. And you can just read through, see whether you agree with the points. And if you do, then you can just sign up and send it off. So that's a really great option. If you've only got a few minutes, you want to say that you support container return scheme, then that's your best option. Then you've got on the Ministry for the Environment site, there's 2 different options that you have for sending submissions in through their system. There's one which is a short, if you just want to do a quick submission, then you've got the option of doing a short one. It's just a few questions and it's focused on the container return scheme. That gives you a chance to just to develop some of your points and have, there's a few different bullet point lists. You can choose which sort of ways you might like to participate in the scheme and those sorts of things. So that one, if you've got a bit more time, maybe 15 minutes while you're having a coffee or something like that, then that's a good option. And then there's a long, the usual long version, which is 30 questions where you can put as much detail in as you like, and you can really give some substantial feedback to the ministry about how you'd like to see the proposals transformed or changed, or what sort of ways you can see that these proposals are going to affect you or your organisation. So the detailed submission, that's maybe, you've got an hour or so or a bit longer to spend on thinking about, putting in those more comprehensive answers. So we've prepared a short, there's the, in the Kiwi Bottle Drive, very quick, short, I'm trying to see what we called it, collective sign and send submission. There's some key points in that you may want to use to support your answers in some of the other longer versions. There's also the Zero Waste Network has put together some fact sheets and guides which are available. And we've also got our more detailed draft submission that we're sharing with everyone. So you can see the key points that we are making. It's not finalized yet. We're still working on it. So we're putting, over time, this will change and develop over the next month or so as we go into the lead up. But it's got our best ideas at the moment about what we think are the critical things to focus on. And obviously it's from our perspective. So, if you're coming from a totally different worldview or a different way of thinking, then there may be things that you see as, from a totally different perspective, but it just gives you a sense of what we're thinking, and you can use that to support any of your submissions that you might choose to put in. So then that's the 3 different ways that you can contribute. And then there's a second thing you can think about. If you've got to, you've sent your submission and you still feel like you want to put a bit more effort into this, then you can share information with people like staff if you're running a site at a council transfer station, or you're running if you're running a community recycle centre or an environment centre, then you can share the fact sheets and the other information with your staff so that they are able to answer the questions of people that come into the counter, or, often there's chances for good conversations about that kind of stuff there. So that's one thing you can do. You can also reach out to people through your social media channels or your friend and relation networks. You might have work networks that you can let people know that there's that quick opportunity to put in that collective sign and send submission, because it's very important that the government has the support it needs to feel confident to go ahead with the next step of putting these proposals into action. If they don't feel like everyone's with them, then they might hesitate on the brink, and we've all worked so hard to get them to this point, really need to get the numbers there. So you can send those things out through your social media, or shoulder tap your partner and your kids to, put in submissions as well. And then something else that you can do is to let your local MP know that container return scheme is something that's very important to you for whatever reason. It might be a personal reason, it might be something to do with your work or your business. But it's really important that you either just send them a message. You can send, they all have their emails on their websites. You can send them an email, just let them know that it's something that's critical to you. Or if you deeply care about it, then make a booking with them to go along to their weekly or monthly electorate meeting. They often have, you can book in a slot to go and see them for 10 or 15 minutes, and you can just have a chat to them so that they understand that it's real and it's something that really matters in their own electorate. And that'll make it much more likely that they'll support it when they see it coming through the select committee, when they see it starting to come through in legislation later this year or beginning of next year. So that's really all I was going to say about that. So you've got 3 different ways of getting submissions in: short, medium and long. And then you've also got that opportunity to really encourage and get as many people as you can to join in the gang and send submissions in as well. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to talk us through the key elements of the proposals and to let you know some of the things that we think are good about them.
Awesome. Thank you, Sue. And thanks, Val, for popping in those links to the things to the different submission portals that Sue just outlined. So the Transforming Recycling Consultation covers 3 proposals. The first is the beverage container return scheme. The second is the standardized curbside recycling. And the third is requiring businesses to separate their food waste. So we're just going to focus on the first proposal today. We'll do webinars later on the other 2. So we're focused on the beverage container return scheme proposal. So this proposal, the government is basically suggesting to implement a beverage container return scheme for all of New Zealand by 2025. So if the government decides to move forward with this following consultation, then it will draft a new piece of legislation to make this happen, and that will end up going through Parliament. So that'll be more things for us to think about further down the track. So what is a beverage container return scheme, or CRS? Most of you will know, but just to cover the basics, it essentially requires a deposit to be put on all beverages sold in New Zealand. Consumers will pay this deposit when they buy the drink, and you get the deposit back when you return the container to an official drop-off point. And this small financial incentive is enough to lift return rates to 85% or higher, which is great because in New Zealand we're currently at 45%, which is tragic. So in addition to this deposit, what's really important to note is that producers also have to pay a scheme fee in addition to the deposit on every container they put on the market. And this fee is what pays for the cost of handling, collecting, transporting, and processing the containers. So a part of this scheme fee is called the handling fee, and that's going to go to anyone operating a return point. So it could be, someone like a zero waste network member. So this scheme fee is what makes a beverage container return scheme a product stewardship scheme, because it's the mechanism by which producers take responsibility for their product. So it's that fancy term, internalizing the costs. Okay, so what is the government proposing that the CRS will look like? Because there's many different ways that you can design a CRS. The first thing is that the government is proposing to include all beverage containers that are under 3 litres into the scheme of all material types. So we're going to see plastic, glass, metal cans, Tetrapak, they're all in. And the government has explained that they're doing this because this is the most simple, cost-effective and efficient approach to treat everyone the same. And this is something that we're really pleased to see, particularly that glass is being included in the scheme. As many of you will know, that has been quite a fight. So we're very pleased to see that, and we will be supporting this comprehensive scheme. The government is proposing to exempt fresh milk from the scheme in any container. So that means that milk will not carry a deposit, and producers will not be covering the scheme fee to cover the costs of collecting and all of that. So milk bottles will continue to go in curbside recycling or rubbish, as is the status quo, and that will be funded by councils. The government has explained that it's doing this because of the cost of living and because milk's drunk at home, so it's more likely to be recycled, and it has no plan for hospitality milk bottle waste. The government's also proposing to exempt refillables from the scheme on the grounds that we don't have enough information about how refillables would work, so it's better to wait for now. But in the meantime, they are proposing to set some targets for more refillables. The government's also proposing to exclude certain materials from the scheme. So this is different from exemption. So they're going to exclude those sucky pouch things and compostable plastic containers. So this means that beverages will not be allowed to be put on the market in these types of containers. So it's almost like a ban on using these materials for beverages. Companies who want to use a sucky pouch thing or compostable plastics can apply to the scheme managing agency to use them, and that will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so that's what's included and what's not. Onto the deposit, the government is proposing the deposit be set at 20 cents, which sits in about the mid-range of global deposits, taking into account average income in different countries. So they can range from 11 cents through to 67 cents. So 20 cents is in the middle. They are also proposing a deposit model. And so what this means is that producers must pay the deposit and scheme fee upfront on 100% of the beverages they put on the market. This is in comparison to a redemption model where they'd only pay out on the containers that consumers return. So the reason the government's going for a deposit model is because that means that there's no incentive for producers to try and suppress return rates to save money. You know, if they only had to pay out on 70%, there'd be a powerful incentive to reduce that. So we're really pleased to see a 20-cent deposit. We will be supporting that. We're also really pleased to see that deposit model, and we will be supporting that as well. Okay, for the returns network, the government is proposing a mixed return model. So what that means is combining return to retail with depots, and they're proposing to make it compulsory for retailers above a certain size to act as a container return point. This means, for example, that supermarkets will be required to participate, and so we'll see lots of those reverse vending machines in supermarket car parks and foyers. So the government wants to make it mandatory for return to retail because this will create a convenient returns network because the countries in the world with the highest return rates globally, they all have mandatory return to retail. For the depots, the government is proposing a voluntary depot procurement model. So they estimate roughly 50 sites for the whole country, and these will be procured by the managing agency through a tender process. And the government sees depots as mainly being for managing commercial container volumes. So they're doing this because they say that depots aren't going to be the focus of the network, because depots are usually on the outskirts of town. And unlike the supermarket, they're not places where people will go anyway. So it reduces the carbon emissions of the scheme if everyone is getting in their cars to go to a place that they usually go rather than somewhere they usually go. That's the government's argument. And the final thing is the government is proposing that the scheme be managed by a non-profit industry-led managing agency. So globally, schemes are always managed by someone, and it's a managing agency. But so the government's saying a non-profit, but industry-led. And they're saying industry-led is okay because of the other aspects of the proposal, the high deposit, the mandatory return to retail, and the deposit model, they think gives enough protection from the risk of industry manipulating the scheme and that in the end, giving industry a bit of influence is good from their perspective because they will be motivated to make the scheme as efficient as possible. So that's the proposals in a nutshell. I'm now going to pass back to Sue to talk about some of the things we'd like to adapt and strengthen. But just to quickly summarize the things that we're excited about is glass being included in, the 20-cent deposit, and the deposit model. Over to you, Sue.
Okay. I'm going to just talk about the three things that we really think need to be adapted and strengthened for this proposal to work really well from our perspective. One of the things that they're trying to do with these changes is to make a big underlying shift in the way that costs and benefits are allocated. So at beverage containers at the moment, the cost of dealing with them is either put onto society, which is ratepayers and councils are picking up the tab for the collections and looking after the litter implications, all the other problems that we see with beverage containers. And then the environment bears a big cost as well with plastic pollution and other problems that we've seen as well. And then the benefits go back to businesses in the supply chain and to the consumers. And what the CRS proposals will do, as Hannah said, is to shift the cost from the producers and the consumers, or shift the cost to the producers and consumers, and reduce the damage to the environment. And that environmental damage is quite big picture, things like unnecessary extraction of virgin material, it's emissions we didn't need to have happen, it's waste disposal and litter. And so the scheme itself has two goals. It has one goal, which is just to get a good scheme off the ground. And so in simple surface level terms, that's great because it gets us a high recovery rate. It means we have clean streams of materials going to reprocessors. And then there's also a deeper opportunity, which we don't see showing through in the document. It's alluded to in the objectives where we talk about we want to see circular economy, to have the scheme help with circular economy goals, help us achieve our get good product stewardship schemes on the table, and we want to see community benefits as the three things that government is saying are the main reasons why they're putting this scheme up. But they're not really looking deeply at how that opportunity could be realized. And we think there's three main things we need to do to get that shift happening. So the first one is a very simple one. It's that, as Hannah said, they're proposing dairy milk is excluded. We would like to see it included. And the main reasons for that is that it's very straightforward if it's in. It means it's an easy to administer scheme. Our GST system has everything, it's all in. That's the way we like to do it in New Zealand, and it's better just to have everything in the same. Makes it simple and straightforward. And it also means that we can tick that job off the list. We don't have to spend years then coming up with a new product stewardship scheme that just works for milk containers and commercial milk containers. So it can be, that would soak up a lot of energy and time over that we don't need to waste. It creates an unfair competitive advantage for dairy milk compared to plant-based milk. And you can see that there's a lot of people are shifting to plant-based milks for all sorts of reasons, sometimes dietary, sometimes want to have a better impact on, global emissions, by shifting into more plant-based foodstuffs, and the relative price on the shelf would be very different if on the day that CRS starts, we get 20-cent deposit plus the handling fee on all of the plant-based milks, but not on dairy. We don't think that's good. The net cost for families of including milk is actually quite low. If you're a big user, you're probably using 2 or 3 litre bottles of milk, so the price is only going to be 1 or 2 cents a litre once you've claimed back your deposit. And then we just don't think that dairy should get a free ride on the curbside system. There's a lot of milk bottles being collected through curbside. It's fair to expect that those producers would help to contribute to the costs as well. So that's one thing. The second thing that we really think needs some attention is to really think about how the managing agency and the governance system is set up. As Hannah said at the beginning, there's been this intention of government to make the scheme industry-led. We don't really see that being a great idea because we see the beverage industry as being, first of all, just one player in the whole chain. And also we see them as having quite a vested interest in how things work. They've got a lot of conflicts of interest around how their activities might interface with any sort of container return scheme, we'd really like to see those managed well. So we'd like to see the managing agency purpose-driven, run by some good staff, and their focus has to be on getting the scheme to run as smoothly as possible, as well as achieving those core objectives around circular economy, product stewardship, and community benefits. So, we don't see that being something that industry has to necessarily be in charge of. We would like to see the governance group independent of any particular interest group. Obviously, and the beverage industry needs to have a part in that, they need to have a role in that group, but it needs to be set up in such a way that councils, consumers, environmental interest groups also are able to participate and be involved, and no one interest group dominates that process. We think that the approach is a bit of a clumsy workaround, by making some pieces of the scheme really well designed in order to drive towards high return rates, and then having this idea that industry can still lead the scheme it puts two things in competition, and it means that all of your different drivers are not aligned. In business, you'd never do that. In community organizations, we would never do that. We always try to align every driver that we can. So it's very important that the managing agency is incentivized to work for the benefit of the scheme rather than for the benefit of any one particular interest group. And we really think there needs to be a bit of work done on the relationship between those different roles. There is some, scoping of it in the document, but it's obviously something that will happen a bit more detail as we move into the legislation phase. But I think it would be good to see a lot more clarity around how the governance will work, how the managing agency will work, and how the network operation side will work. And that's something that we're advocating for, and we're putting forward a few thoughts on that. The third thing that I just wanted to say a few words about is the mixed return model. As Hannah said, it's a model which has been put forward by government. It's very heavily weighted towards the idea that supermarkets or big supermarkets will be the places you go when you want to take back your containers. We agree that it's really good to have that RVM technology as the backbone of the system, but we don't see it having to be only used at supermarkets or return to retail sites. It could work just as well at a depot or a community recycle centre. Convenience is really critical. You want people to be able to get take their containers back really easily, and you also want them to be able to get access to their deposits, because for some households, that extra few dollars that they're putting in every week, it's really important to keep that rolling back around so it doesn't affect their household budget too much. But we think that the balance of 600 plus supermarkets and 50 odd depots is out of whack. We would really like to see more thought put into how the rollout of the container return scheme overlaps with the government's intention and councils and other people's intentions to create a nationwide resource recovery network. We'd like to see how they're thinking about how the existing community recycle centres and zero waste hubs fit in, how the container return scheme could support the transition of council transfer stations to resource recovery centres, and how other community hubs like marae and environment centres could also become depots and benefit from that sort of foot traffic and engagement with the people as they come through to drop off their containers. We would really like to see how a lot more thought go into how the container return scheme could help achieve bigger picture goals around circular economy, emissions reduction, and local resilience. So some of the things that could happen if we start to have container return scheme drop-off points at, say, a community recycle centre like Wastebusters or Extreme Waste, or one of the sites like Sustainability Trust in Wellington, would be that ability to develop local economy, and it helps to support communities to build capacity and capability that will then in turn enable them to become much more resilient over time. The return to retail model, on the surface level, you can take your container back, get your deposit, and then you're left standing outside the supermarket. So the most likely thing you're going to do is go inside and buy another drink. Whereas if you go into your local community recycle centre, your transfer station, or go to a zero waste hub, then you take your container back, you get your deposit exactly the same. It's still very convenient because we know that hundreds of thousands of people go to these sites every year around New Zealand. But you'll get a much deeper level of engagement. You get exposed to lots of new ideas and new ways of doing things. And there's also lots of opportunities to reuse, refill, shop secondhand, to repair, to get access to behavior change and other services and support. And this kind of engagement really shifts the focus of whole communities over time. And we can see the evidence really clearly of this. You know, we've got sites like Raglan or Extreme Waste in Raglan or Wastebusters in Wanaka or Alexandra, where the community has really shifted in its thinking over the 20 years that facility has been in place. So we'd love to see a lot more thought go into that side of it and see a much better balance between the drop-offs at supermarkets and the drop-offs at other facilities that could be tapped into in communities. So I'm going to hand back to Hannah, and she's going to talk to you about refillables and how, you know, that part of the proposal needs to be strengthened.
Hello. I just dropped offline. Did I come back on just in time to talk about that's miraculous?
Perfect,
okay.
Hannah, thank you. Yeah.
No, yes. Sorry, I could have done that so smoothly without even bringing it up. Okay, all right. So refillables. Thank you, Sue, for what you just said, whatever it was. So refillables, as we all know, because we're all into zero waste, working up the waste hierarchy is really important, and reusing bottles and containers, kegs, all of that kind of stuff is more energy efficient than single-use containers, even if they get recycled, and also generates much less waste. So this is something that we want to work and recycling can't be the only thing that we're striving for. And what's really great is that the government has acknowledged in their consultation document that refillables are something that they want to see more of, and they would like to see the CRS move towards refillables. So that's great. We also support the proposal that the government's put forward to set refills targets. So what this means is that there'll be targets like New Zealand must have X percentage of beverages on the market by X date need to be in some sort of refillable packaging, which could either be on tap, you know, in kegs, or returnable bottles. So what's really important is that these targets need to be binding. They need to be set out in the CRS legislation. And they also need to be designed well to reflect what works overseas. So there's many different ways that targets can be designed, and not all of them work very well, and some work really well. So overseas, it's been shown that targets need to apply to individual beverage producers, not the beverage industry as a whole. Because if it applies to the beverage industry as a whole, then you can't hold anyone accountable for failing to meet the target. So for example, in Germany, they've actually got a refillable target of 70% of beverage producers need to be beverage containers need to be refillable, and they don't meet it, and there's no way of holding anyone accountable for it. So apply to individual companies, and they also need to be applied to retailers and hospitality sector as well, so that a certain percentage of the beverages they stock are in refillables. And there are some really great examples of refill targets that work really well overseas, including in Austria, France, Portugal, and Romania. So we need to look to these countries when we're designing our targets. The other thing that we'd like to see adapted and strengthened is this whole thing that refillables are blanket exempt from the scheme. This won't have the desired effect of supporting refillables to grow. It's going to work well for refill systems that already exist, like say ABC's Swap a Crate, but it's not going to work well for emergent companies wanting to break into the market. So we think refillables should be allowed to opt into the scheme voluntarily if they want to. If they opt in, they have to pay a deposit and scheme fees just like everyone else. We think the opt-in model makes sense because by being part of the scheme, refillables will then be able to access the returns network and benefit from the wraparound logistics system that's going to be set up for all the other containers. Because if they can't access the returns network, beverage producers wanting to do reuse actually have to then organize and run all the logistics themselves. And this is currently a barrier to reuse. So it's not cost effective or viable to do that. So we'd like to see opt-in for refillables. And the last thing is that in addition to a target, we think there also needs to be a producer-facing levy or economic incentive on single-use containers to create a strong financial incentive for companies to shift towards refillables to avoid that levy. And this will accelerate the uptake of refillables much faster than a target, but we do also need targets as well. Sweet, that's all I had. Is that us?
Yeah, kia ora, that's awesome. Thank you very much. I guess I just want to line everybody up and encourage you all to think about your questions. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one is, would containers that are crushed, squashed be accepted in the return scheme, or containers that are not cleaned properly?
No, they wouldn't. If they need to be whole and still able to be, the barcode still be able to, barcode scanning will be the mechanism that they'll use to be able to get them back through. So it, and dirty as well, won't be accepted. So, you need to bring along your clean container in its whole form so that it can be scanned and recognized as a container that's in the scheme to be able to get your deposit back.
Cool, thank you, Sue. And another question says, hi, Sue, I understand your arguments about depots, behavior change and community change, but also wonder whether Zero Waste Network members would have opportunities in managing the RVMs that are placed within retail areas. Supermarkets may not want to be able to own and manage these.
It really depends on how government decides to set up and to buy or to procure, or to, through the contract to procure the network operation services. It may be that they'll decide to just give those all to one big contractor and say, okay, well, we're just going to have one guy across the whole country who's going to do all of that. They're going to have the relationships with the supermarkets, and they're going to be the people who do all the logistics and the handling. And what we would say is that it would be much better to have a more distributed and diverse supply system for those services. It would be much better to have multiple people able to participate in that process, so that, say, local transport people can get involved in the transport leg, local depot people could run depots. They might just run a depot or a reverse vending machine to take back the materials. They might service other people who have local depots. They might go to the supermarket or whatever and clear away all the material that's coming out the back end of their machine. They might be taking materials from commercial collections or small to medium enterprise drop off, hospitality, people dropping off all of their containers. They might and could be taking material from fundraising projects. Somebody does a big collection like an old-fashioned bottle drive, brings a whole pile of containers down to the site to drop them in. And I think there's multiple different options. So what we'd really like to see the government do is to do some sort of innovative social procurement type process where they hold in mind the short-term goal of getting a good, efficient system, as well as the longer term goals of shifting us towards more circular systems, local economy, involving Māori and other, enterprise that's operating and sometimes on the margin at the moment and needs to be brought into the, much more into the mainstream, and also opportunities for local economies to grow and develop. We saw with the latest Kantar Better Futures report that one of the ways that people really see is being able to support their, sustainability and local is through local procurement and local enterprise, local business. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to grow and develop those local economies through the scheme. And that's what we're arguing for. So, none of that is clear yet. There's sort of just a few loose words about, we're going to do it, there's going to be a managing agency and they're going to do a tender round to get these guys to come and do the service. So we really need to paint a good picture of what we'd like to see. And I'd love to hear people's ideas about that.
Cool, thank you, Sue. And probably one for you, Hannah. How would refillable schemes access their containers mixed amongst everything else if they opted in?
Yeah, this is actually one reason why it's really important that refillables are included from the outset, or at least that the system is future-proof to envision them coming on, because if we get a whole bunch of infrastructure that can't cope with refillables, it's hard to retrofit after the fact. Most reverse vending machines are capable of telling the difference between refill and single use, because most places where reverse vending machines operate already are in markets with both. So yeah, there isn't a technological barrier. And in terms of depots, that, you know, the refill containers tend to have a different label on them, or they're clearly marked as refill containers. So to be part of a scheme, they would have to participate in, you know, agreed shared labeling and so on. So they would be easily identified either through a machine or manually. And the main difference is actually less in identifying them and more how you deal with the back end. So like in a reverse vending machine at a supermarket, you have to have space in the back for refillables. So in many cases, if it's single use, the glass, for example, will be instantly crushed to save space. This is obviously something that you can't do with refillables. So these things have to be thought through from the outset before we set up the scheme. But it's definitely possible to do them in parallel. It's done in many markets overseas where there's a CRS.
Cool, thanks, Hannah. Someone's asked a very general question about explaining more about how the levy on single-use containers and how that would work. And you've directed them over in the chat to the Kiwi Bottle Drive website. So I just want to highlight that for people. There's a couple of great links there to a couple of easy to understand ways. Many of us will be familiar with the old-fashioned kind of bottle returns. It's essentially the same idea, but if you do have more specific questions about the kind of handling fee and how that money, that 20 cents, is broken down, those are some good places to turn to. So Agnes has asked, will refund of deposit vary if a bottle has a lid on it or not?
It's
there is some discussion in the proposal around lids. Do you want to address lids at all?
I'll say something about lids. There's been an ongoing saga about lids as long as I've been involved in this industry. For like 20 years, people are like, lids on, lids off, lids on, lids off. And the most important thing is that we all agree whether they're on or off. Most of the recyclers have mechanisms for, you know, you can float out different plastic materials. So the guys who do the reprocessing often have systems in place already for dealing with it. The main issue is with the confusion that public have about, oh, what do I do? It's different in a different community to this community. You know, here I am on holiday and they're telling me to take the lids off, and when I'm at home, I don't have to. And so that's what the part 2 of the proposals is really trying to get clear, to have one clear, consistent system that everyone does the same and that people don't get confused or worried about it, and we can stop having this conversation. In simple terms, it'll be really good if we had the same decision for curbside as for CRS, so either they're on or off. But I think everyone has their own opinion about exactly how that might play out in reality. And I just had a thought about the question about the levy. I wondered whether the person wanted to know about the idea of a levy, you know, a single-use levy, rather than the CRS return fee. Maybe Hannah, if you just want to say something about that.
Yeah, so it's, if we keep in our minds separate the deposit and the scheme fees. So the deposit just does what it does, and the scheme fee is what's funding everything in the background. That's what the producers pay. So the government is proposing that the scheme fee will vary depending on the cost of collecting certain materials and processing them. So for example, Tetrapak is hard to recycle, so they probably will end up paying more scheme fee than aluminium, who actually might not even pay any fee at all because aluminium is so valuable and so easily recycled. So within those scheme fees, they're also suggesting that we might want to eco-modulate the fees based not only on the cost of recycling, but actually the environmental outcome. So for example, you might, like plastic might end up having a higher eco-modulation fee than glass or whatever. I mean, I'm just saying examples. I'm not sure how it would end up. But within that, you have the option of refillables paying a lower fee because they're more environmentally beneficial. Or you could just have within that scheme fee a consistent single-use levy on every container that sits in addition to the eco-modulating scheme fees, but that would all be behind the scenes producer facing, so it wouldn't be a consumer facing. It's not like when people go and buy a drink that levy would hit them at that point. It would all be covered in the scheme fee. So this is done in places like Norway, have a single-use levy that everyone pays on their containers if they put a single-use container on the market at the same time as they're paying their deposit and so on. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great, Hannah, thank you. There's another question from Abby there. Do you have any thoughts about the inclusion of liquid paperboard containers? How recyclable are these? Really, would it be an option for this material to be included with the sucky pouches, e.g. not allowed to be sold?
Do you want to go on that, Sue? Me? Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky one. Liquid paperboard is going to have a higher scheme fee because of the difficulty of processing. And I think, to be honest, it's a question of, sorry, there's a lawnmower there. There's really a question around how realistic it is to ban Tetrapak at this point in time, given that so there's a sort of a range of products that sort of had to go in it, for want of a better word. So those sucky pouches are generally considered to not really be meeting a need that couldn't be met by another packaging type. And similarly with compostable plastic bottles, the goal isn't to increase the composting of packaging, it's to increase the recycling, and compostable bottles can't be recycled. And it's generally considered they're not a helpful addition to the packaging market. So those are the reasons for excluding those materials, but I don't think it's very realistic that they would exclude Tetrapak at this point in time. And it looks likely that all those Tetrapak are either going to go to Saveboard to be turned into a jib alternative in Auckland, in Hamilton, or exported for processing. And the producers will just pay the cost for that, plus an eco-modulation fee because it's downcycling, not recycling. So it's going to be more expensive to use that packaging.
Yeah, I think there's one other interesting thing is that the Tetrapak, the people who manufacture Tetrapak have all got together and created a factory where they could make what they're calling a useful product out of the Tetrapaks that they're collecting. There's all sorts of different arguments around whether it's upcycling or downcycling that they're doing, but at least they are taking responsibility for doing something about at least half of the Tetrapak type material that's going into the market. And so in some ways that is a step towards product stewardship or effective, producer responsibility. But I think all of those types of questions are still, the work in progress. There's no absolute answer around it yet.
Cool. There's a couple of other questions in the chat. A couple of them relate to the liquid paperboard, but I'll go to Joe's question first, which is where would I find best information for beverage producers about how the scheme looks for them? At what point are the 2 or 3 levies implemented?
I might just jump in quickly because I think I saw that you put craft brewers. That was a government official did a webinar specifically for craft brewers yesterday, so I can forward you the link if you give me a private message and send you the link to that. But the government landing page for the consultation, there are a lot of documents in there, but possibly just listening to that webinar is the easiest way because it's been tailored for producers. Also on the government website itself, they did a webinar for industry on, I think it was the 29th of March, and the recording for that is there too, and that's also for that. In terms of when the levy and fees are going to be implemented, that is still an open discussion at the moment, but it's framed as when it's put on the market. So it's very unlikely to be the point of filling. It's not going to be when you buy the containers before filling them. It's very likely to be when they're sold to a retailer or sold direct to the consumer, and that's because of cash flow issues. But that is going to be something that's discussed further along the track if the government goes on with the proposal, and there's going to be a lot more discussion. I'm just feeding in here secondhand information that I've heard government officials say on that exact question you asked.
Cool, thank you, Hannah. There's a couple of other questions, and one of them I think you've sort of answered in respect of Tetrapak, and it should liquid paperboard have its own product stewardship scheme. I don't know if either one of you want to say anything more about Tetrapak. They do already have something of that in the works. And following on from that, Liam's question is, are there any other exclusions we should be pushing for apart from the sucky pouches and compostable bottles?
On the Tetrapak, whether they should have a separate scheme, just to answer that really quickly, no. The most efficient, effective, simple thing to do is apply the same rules to everybody. And you have those eco-modulating fees that vary based on the recyclability of the product. Treating different materials differently, it's just not a good plan, and sometimes it can backfire and have perverse consequences, and it makes it more expensive to manage the materials that are easily recycled.
And do either one of you want to tackle that about other exclusions?
I can't think of any, but there's probably some. Feel free to put in the chat any bugbears you have. You can add it to the list.
Yeah, I was just racking my brains as well. And I think all those arguments Hannah made for not excluding a particular material apply to milk as well, and not excluding a particular beverage. You know, there's sort of lots of complicated reasons why you can leave something out, but it's always much more straightforward and simple if you can have a grab or do it once, get it over and done with. Yeah, be interesting to hear what people would like to leave out.
Right. I don't see any further questions at this point. Is there any? I'll just leave it a minute. Is there anybody else who has a question? You can put your hand up or put a question in the chat if there's anything else. I just remind everybody that the submissions for the container return scheme and the whole of the transforming recycling proposals, which include not only the container return scheme, but also the standardization of curbside recycling and the inclusion and the requirement for businesses to separate out organic materials, is all due on the 8th of May. We will be doing another follow-up webinar on Tuesday, the 26th of April, at the same time, 12 to 1, to talk about the other two components of this proposal. So the container return scheme is a really, really important part of it, particularly for the Zero Waste Network and for our members. So we wanted to give it a specific hour to talk to this because it is such an important scheme, something we've worked for a very long time. But those other two proposals are also really important, and we want to talk to them. So I encourage people to come along to that other webinar. So that's Tuesday, the 26th of April at noon. You'll find a link on our Facebook page, a Zoom link, so you can jump onto the call. And the other thing is that on the Zero Waste, on this chat here, but also on the Zero Waste Network, website, is a link to our draft submission. So that includes all three parts of the submission. And so you can read the full thinking behind Sue and Hannah and also Liam Prince, who's contributed to the organics section of that document, all of the stuff that we're thinking about. And that's probably not going to be finalized, but we would encourage you to take parts of that submission and use it for your own submissions as you find useful or helpful in any way. So I don't see any further questions at this stage. So I think we will close the webinar. And yeah, I'd just like to say a very big thank you to Hannah and Sue, always for your expertise in these matters. And I think everybody really appreciates that. You got some thumbs up and some claps there. And really to thank you to everybody for spending your lunch hour with us today. We appreciate having you here with us and your interest in these proposals, which are so important to our members. We encourage people to reach out to Sue, to Hannah, or to me, to anybody in the network. If you have questions, feel free to get in touch with us, to email us, to message us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, whatever. If there are things that you're confused about, you're not sure about, and you want a little bit more information, feel free to reach out. So again, thank you to everybody. And I'll just close with a karakia, which is in the chat. If you'd like to follow along, you feel free. E karakia tātou. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te aru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia māma te nāka, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takata. Hoi ara I rongo whakaeri ake ki runga kia tina. Tina. Aumi e ui e, tae ki e. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Thank you again, everybody. We'll see you next time.